issue
Woo.
of the Mattriarchy. I am, of course, Matt Rhys, and tonight I am joined by MattC
What's up, guys?
of Kyrie fame, and also the most interesting archaeology feed on Twitter. And tonight we're also joined by Claire, StarStoryTeller.
I'm crashing the Metrox, the Metro. I'm crashing. I'm abroad. I'm invading the space.
No, you're fine. You're fine. Or you're invading species, like kudzu or something. You're fine. You don't need all mats all the time. It's just, there's just a lot of us.
Yeah, if you were born between like 1982 and 1989, there's like a 1 in 3 chance your name is Matt.
Yeah, it's just
Not quite, but it is true. Now, I go by Rhys. You can see my little tag here. And the reason, I don't think I've told you guys, if you've ever been here when I've told this story before, but I was born in 78, and my mother wanted to give me a name that was not uncommon, but wasn't normal, right? It was a name people had heard, but not a name people used. And so she picked Matthew, right? But what she didn't understand is that in 77, 78, and 79 was the third most common name for a boy born in the U.S. or Canada.
Yep.
And so
it's our plight. I don't understand. Like, everyone thinks they're original at the same
for
time.
Like 15 years. I'm sorry, Matt?
Everyone thinks they're original at the exact same time. That's the funny thing. These baby names, Like,
I'm reading baby names.
Yeah. It's gonna get you either way. I mean, there's so many creative names right now, but they're all I'm hearing a lot of the same, I have a niece named Nora, and that sounded really creative about 7 years ago. And now it's like
Nick
every little girl.
came out about that time.
Yeah.
So now my sons, I have a pair of boys, and they're very proud of them. They are Don and Taliesin.
Yeah, you had to really reach back into your ancestry to get that, because otherwise.
The funny thing about Taliesin is that his mother picked out the name, right? And
oh, cool.
I am of course a huge Kimrophile, right? I love all things Welsh. Generation in America. My grandfather's father came here as a young boy from Wales, and so I'm very interested in that culture. But I married a gal who's half German, German American, but both of her on her side of the family, both sides of it's a Klein saucer and a Wetzel, right? They immigrated a few generations ago, but they stayed in like cloistered German communities in North Dakota and South Dakota. So they're very, very German. My grandfather was Augustus Wetzel. Right?
Oh man, you can't get more German than Wetzel.
No, it's really tough. So I married this girl who was half German, and love her to pieces. But I didn't want to foist my cultural fixation on her, right? On our kids' names. I mean, I kind of wanted to, but I didn't want to be that guy.
Yeah.
My wife when she was pregnant with our second boy. With our first boy, we tussled back and forth and settled on Donovan. And it turns out that my grandfather's cousin was a Donovan Rhys too. And so I didn't know that at the time. Settled on Donovan through the way it worked out. And but when she was pregnant with our second boy, she came to me. She says, "I want to name him Taliesin." And I said, "Oh my God, are you serious?" So for those of you who may watch later, because no one's tuned in yet, but for those of you who may watch later, Taliesin is the name of a 5th century Welsh bard who some of his poems are tied into the old Arthur stories, and they retell parts of those that became the Arthuriad. So the Arthuriad as we know it predates, and it wasn't written as a coherent legendarium. That was added on as time went. But it's a little bit historical and a little bit made up and a little bit mythic and a little bit mundane. It was largely, it existed in a series of folk legends in Wales and poems in Wales. And then it was taken by the French and turned into the romances that were for popular consumption. And so a lot of your big elements actually come from French stories. But
very Frenchified.
Very, very Frankified. And there's I don't want to get into too much about Arthurian legend there, because there's actually a whole lot to talk about. That's not the point of today's conversation.
Anyway.
So, although, one moment.
Oh my gosh, this size filters.
Here it is.
So,
Okay.
please find it somewhere. So Claire, do you go by Claire or Star Storyteller? Like,
I go by Claire because my full name is actually Clarissa, but I go by Claire because it's monosyllabled.
mm-hmm.
So, do you in fact explain it all?
Yes, on occasion I can, and I might.
Oh, good. That's
Nice throwback.
That's germane to the conversation.
Yes. Yes.
I'm sorry. That was
Well, it's funny you're talking about names because I think we haven't figured. We're waiting until we know if we have a boy or a girl. I'm 3 months pregnant, by the way.
Oh, congrats.
Oh, thank you. And the one thing we decided kind of early that we both agree on is that if we have a girl, it's going to be a girl's name. If it's a boy, it's going to be a boy's name. It's not going to be gender neutral, whatever. we're just like very feminine or very masculine. That's our only.
Understood. Like, there's a few names like Kim, and if you're French, Michelle, that kind of cross the line.
Mm-hmm.
I can see.
Or my sister's name is Courtney, and apparently that one in the UK is considered a man's name, not a woman's name.
Yeah.
But you could see that one could go back and forth.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, there's some like that I think that make sense, but I don't understand the penchant, if you will, of naming little girls blatantly masculine names, right? Like Elliot or Charles.
Spencer.
What about something like a Bobby Ray or something? Or
see,
I mean, that's and you throw an I on instead of a Y. I mean, that's like a time-honored tradition, at least in the South where I'm from.
Yeah, that's true. And like Bobby Rays are often actually Robertas, right?
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Is Bobby Ray like a nickname for Roberta?
Yeah, it's Bob. Bob is of course a diminutive of Robert. So Roberta is a very common English feminization of Robert, which is of course a masculine French name. So Roberta Ray is a pretty common thing, and that's a Bobby Ray, right?
Oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to ask. I know a Bobby Ray. I'm gonna ask her.
And it may not be.
Roberta.
I mean, it's just like I've met people who were just Bob, and it was like Robert, Bob. It's Bob.
No diminutive. It isn't a diminutive. It is my name. So.
Like, that doesn't change the fact it's diminutive. Listen, that's how words work.
That's because people are. Oh, remind me to. Okay, let's cross.
Now, here's the funny thing about that to me is that you think about, and the word diminutive, of course, it means familiar, but the word parts mean small, right? So,
right.
Stephen to Steve, Matthias to Matthew to Matt, right? So,
right.
But I know a girl named Stevie, and that threw me off for a second. But I feel like that's a pretty feminine name. I don't know about you, but
I mean, and like some Stevies are Stephanies, and some. Steve,
oh my gosh, you're blowing my mind here.
Well, not always. like there's it's from Stephen, right? That's comes through the French and
I got all kinds of questions.
It's always the French.
It's not, well, our language, the English language, right, which began, of course, as a complex pigeon of Anglo-Saxon, German, heavily influenced by Latin and by French, Norman French, and put on top of a Celtic substrate. So, there's some of the way. It's.
But the nice thing about it is that because it's so pigeony and weird, it actually is very conducive to different foreign speakers to be able to speak it. That is one cool thing about it.
Yeah, it's more accessible. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's interesting is they say it's really hard to learn, but I think it's hard to learn correctly because I think what they mean.
Right.
Yeah, because there's so many exceptions to so many rules.
Exactly. But communicating in English is really broad. You can get your point across imperfectly with a fair amount of ease. Days to learn, a lifetime to master, maybe. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're still trying to master it ourselves. Let's be real here.
Well, some of
I think we need to make this size.
So, anyway, I called you guys on today to talk about something we've all in pieces and together talked about a little bit here and there. As I said, my thesis is called The Enduring Things. And I'm talking about is philosophy, politics, and religion. Okay? And one of the things about those elements is, everybody says you don't talk about them in polite conversation, polite company.
Oh my, I hate that.
But what else is worth talking about, right?
Right, but there's a way to talk about it too. So
that's true. That's true.
Yeah, what we learned is we forgot how to have those conversations without freaking out at each other. That's the problem.
Kind of like sex.
Yeah.
And
I'm sorry,
well, I said kind of like conversations about sex or healthy, like healthy conversations you can have that aren't like grotesque but like how to have a nuanced conversation about what are your boundaries, why parents might encourage you to wait or that sort of thing, and having that kind of coherent discussion. It kind of reminds me of what was it? Jordan Peterson, when he was talking about relationships, and he said, what often happens is that people will engage in physical intimacy, but they won't discuss what they're going to do ahead of time. And his thing is like, don't do anything you wouldn't discuss with someone first.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, but that's part of that communication. So yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I actually think part of the reason that we have trouble making those distinctions and having those conversations is actually because you have a breakdown in an understanding, an underlying understanding of what I call the enduring things, right? The things that always exist and always matter. And I think that's a big part of it. It's just like we have a lot of conversation here in America about, we can't be divided by politics. But that is by nature a political statement, right? Mm-hmm. And it misses the point about what it actually is, and that's why I think that those things, those taboo conversations, are the only conversations that matter, because they're really about how we know and can understand the world around us as an existing thing.
Right.
And so it comes back to the whole idea of how we can know what we can know and what are the assumptions that are based on that. And I think it's understanding those sorts of things and understanding that they're really all part of a contingent and a connected worldview, that it keeps us from actually, being able to participate and exchange ideas back and forth with each other and understand the limits of knowledge, and that just because you disagree doesn't mean that you hate a person. And all of those sort of civility ideas are wrapped up in the concept that they're all connected. And we try to, I think, dissect and divert and separate our perspectives in a way that keeps us from understanding anything. And in part, I blame John Dewey. But
Who's John Dewey?
John Dewey was an educator and educational philosopher.
Oh, of course it was.
And he believed that the world was getting so complicated in our new modern era that no longer would we need to teach people to be the idea that we'd had in education prior to this is Cicero's idea. And I didn't know it was Cicero until recently. I knew that it was the idea, but I didn't know where it came from. But the idea that the best citizen is the ideal individual, and every person should be trained in you know the
classics
and the classics, and in reason, and in civics, and in the philosophy of government, and in religious principles. And when each person knows these things exceptionally, then they are less dependent upon society and are therefore better able to give back to society through official and unofficial channels. And the ideal individual, therefore, is the ideal citizen. And that was an idea that had its origins deep in the past and in many of Cicero's writings, and even back to some of the Greek thinkers, and was proudly defended in the Revolutionary War era and after by the Websters and by
so basically Dewey thought, let me see if I understand this correctly.
Okay.
Dewey thought that common life was so complicated you wouldn't need education?
That rather we wouldn't need a complete education. That if we set society down where people became experts in their field and nothing else, everybody would have a specific place to fit into the machine, and life would be more pleasant because you wouldn't have to worry about the big questions because that was somebody else's job.
Is this the Scottish Industrial Revolution guy?
Yeah, exactly. Just after the Industrial Revolution. Yep.
Yeah, I've heard about that guy.
It's always these idiots that just think, oh, well, he never foresaw Twitter, didn't he?
Well,
I like the individualist Cicero stuff, but Dewey's kind of grand scheme of how to structure society with the whole, like, wasn't he doing like the planned factory towns and stuff like that?
His writing really gained a lot of steam in the 30s and 40s, but a lot of that came after because the first progression, right, from of the industrial age it was a mess, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And what ended up happening is, so there were all of these thinkers that are like, we have to rethink our entire society because the idea of the agrarian individualist just doesn't work anymore because everyone's fleeing the country to the cities, and we have these cities that are all of a sudden full of squalor and
This sounds like just people making things worse.
well, and the thing is, the cities are always full of squalor, so I don't think that's a valid argument.
Here's what I don't understand. Wouldn't it make more sense to create individuals in cities? Because then they can at least, even if they're too close together, then they can actually have those very complex and interesting exchanges of ideas at a much faster rate.
Right. So here is the basic conflict in every nature of society, right? Is there are two competing ideas that, and this is the, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, right? Because I'm just some guy who dropped out of college. So maybe you guys have had one thing. But to my way of looking at history and looking at society and people and everything else, there are two ideas that have been in conflict for centuries, right? And the one is the idea of the individual, right? That the individual has rights over himself within this mortal coil, right? And that the individual will always, or most always, make the best decision for themselves. That they're the individual is the expert on themselves, right? The other idea is that the rulers know best. That's how they got to be rulers. So since the rulers know best, we should just trust them because that's why we hired them to begin with, right? So the rule by kings or experts on the one hand, and the rule by the individual on the other. You've got the formal versus the informal.
That's a good breakdown, yeah.
Right, and I think that's the core of every conflict in human history, right?
I'd add one more stipulation.
Go for it.
Those who wish to rule over others and those who wish to be left alone.
Right. And I think
Yeah,
I actually think outgrows the same idea.
Because if you can self-govern yourself, then and are given the tools effectively to do it, then it's there. But it is this. There is, in a way, though, I will say this, that there, in reality, in my more practical side of my brain, is that there are people who cannot rule themselves for whatever reason. They're too messed up. They're too whatever, and they need something a little bit more structured. And we all need a little bit of structure too, until you're disciplined enough that you can just do whatever or not run into anybody. So there are those who cannot be independent enough to do it. But on the other hand, there are also those who are the sociopathic, blood-sucking politicians that want to control everyone and want to, moral busybodies, I suppose, that kind of want to go up and control people. And it is about power. It's not about actually helping people and wanting to help people. And it is hard because it's trying to figure out who's trying to control who. And it is about power. And everyone wants some degree of power. And you have to be honest with yourself that you want to do that.
Yeah.
Maybe it got a little dark there, but
well, no, I think, and here's the thing is, right, when we're looking at this concept of a single philosophy being at the root of every conflict, right, which is what I'm proposing, we have to understand that there are exceptions to rules and where that may fit into a general idea.
But the thing is, the rules are they prove the rule. They don't explain away the rule or something like that.
Well, the exception that proves the rule is the cliche, and I don't want to disregard that because I think that's an important thing to add on here. It's an important consideration is are the exceptions an expected or predictable exception or derivation from the rule, right? Or let me give you an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about, right? So if we assume that the humankind, and this is maybe a controversial assumption, right? But if we assume that humankind is designed with two genders, be sexually dimorphous, and that the design for humans is a heterosexual lifestyle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh-oh.
There we go. We're going in raw.
Oh, what time is it?
Well, here it's almost 8. For the sake of argument, if we just make that assumption, right, that's the standard. When I mean standard, I'm not talking about in what makes something right and wrong. I'm talking about in terms of the design of the machine of the human body, right? If we're looking at that human being is a designed element, then what are the things that are part of that design? And if we make the assumption,
in other words, what biology actually does, not what we want it to do.
And because, like, you know, and on an argument in the way of what you're saying there is you're looking at reflect what we find, not what we hope, right? So since we know that human beings reproduce through direct relationship to our sexual dimorphism, then we can assume that that's part of the original construct with whatever kind of design there may be, you know, and not to assume too much of what that means, but there's obviously some sort of something in place. Okay. If we assume that, and we also look at the humankind as some kind of as a design that can break down, right? Then, you know, sexual dysfunction of any kind would need to be a derivation from that original design, right? And so and so if, like, if you were to say that, like, and maybe dysfunction is too big a word, right? I mean, too strong a word, I should say. But if you're looking at, like if homosexuality is a derivation from the design, right? Because of the design,
maybe a variation or
a variation, even if you're looking for some sort of adaptive structure, right? But it is a variation or a derivation or a change that is actually predictable based upon a sexually dimorphous populace, right? As a machine, a structure of human beings that has the male and the female, and that's how the society is built, because those are the gender types that exist to reproduce that society. Then it makes sense that if that design is derivated, that along the track of those derivations or those changes or those alterations of that original design, then a homosexual lifestyle or a homosexual inclination could be part of a derivation from that original design, right? So that's an out there example, right? Now, that's not making any kind of moral commentary on it. Just looking at the concept that if there is a variety or a derivation or some sort of exception to a philosophic rule, right? It's still in order to consider it, and or say it as rather to disprove the idea that there is this unifying philosophy of human relationships. And I'm not talking sexual. I'm talking about politics. I'm talking about social dynamics, all that kind of stuff. If we assume that there is a unifying theory or function behind those, then those exceptions to the rule should be predictable under that model, right? And if they're not, then it's flawed, right? So when it comes to the idea that there are people that cannot take care of themselves in some stripe or another, right? Then are those things that are predictable under the idea of this unifying philosophy? So all of that is to say, when we talk about people that may or may not be able to be self-ruling, go ahead and set that off to the side for the moment and come back to it in a little bit, right? I can really my way around something.
I think it's interesting because I think that exception to the rule is, like, practically speaking, that's probably where most political issues take place, is within that kind of crack, in the system. Is what do you do when not everyone's taking care of themselves the way they should,
Right.
And there's two different answers to that, I think. More of an individualist and more of a collectivist view of, and how are you going to categorize and how are you going to anticipate who, there's some ideologies that try to anticipate based on certain categories what sort of people can and can't self-rule,
such as people presuming women can't defend themselves, can't negotiate their way through the work environment. And now we're in this huge pickle where post Me Too, people are flat out just seeing women as a liability and not hiring them or mentoring them or bringing them up along. And of course, they keep saying, oh, it's men because they're pissed because women are disrupting the power structure. That's like, no, you are a liability. If you don't make yourself useful, you make yourself a liability.
Yeah, and I definitely think that's a factor. And then we have to always look at, when it comes to work environment, what makes you worth the risk? Because every employee is at risk, right?
Right, and that's another thing too, because who is taking the ultimate risk? It's not the employee, it's the entrepreneur who's starting the business. And not only that, if this particular, like, they hire some broad, some bimbo to come in, and she comes in And she starts accusing people. Not only does she cost them money, but she could also cost their best worker money and all kinds of other stuff. And in a way, it kind of was with Weinstein. That's why Weinstein was able to get away with a lot of the stuff, because he was a moneymaker, and it was very hard. And even though in that case it was legit, it still was like, uh-oh, we don't want to get rid of him because of other stuff. And so that's why it all blew up.
I think that's an important aspect on that too. But going back to the because that's a very specific case, right? And
Sorry.
As pragmatism, you want to look at specific cases. But looking at the overall picture, right? The idea that if politics and religion and philosophy are all the same thing, how can that be true, right? So the thing that I want to go ahead and talk about my concept of these things and how they relate to each other, right?
So can you get it really simply? Because I'm kind of not as smart.
So first of all, what is politics? What's a good definition of politics? Let's ask you guys, because I know what I think, but let's get your opinion.
You go ahead, Matt. I'm thinking.
Oh man, I got a cookie in my mouth. I think it's
What kind of cookie?
Chocolate chip. It's a little. I'm worried it's vegan. I'm concerned it's vegan. It doesn't taste great. I'd say politics is the trying to craft methods of how to govern communities, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah. That's a terrible definition, but
how to centralize the use of force and the use of providing at the same time.
Wow, that's better.
Yeah, it is better. But I have one better. And it's not original to me, right? But politics is the affairs of men in society. Right? And the reason,
and women too now.
Oh yeah, I mean mankind, right? You don't throw women to man-eating sharks. We're going with that definition of men. But yeah, the affairs of human beings in society, what I would call politics. And the reason I feel so strongly that that's the correct one is because of how we use the word politics in everyday language, right?
Like political correctness and
political correctness. There's politics. There's office politics. There's high school politics, right?
Yeah.
There's grievance politics.
Exactly, and
which is the example I was bringing up.
We use these to refer to any time that anybody uses an opinion to try to influence anybody else. Right? Opinions are facts, right? When two people disagree with a third person, and that affects their working relationship, it's called a political dispute, right? We use it freely like this all the time, but when anybody talks about politics, they immediately, right, revert it to be thinking about, we're talking about, governments and elections and city councils and all that kind of stuff.
That's a good point.
But all those things are formalizations of the relationships that we deal with on an everyday basis, right?
Yeah, the public sphere, I guess. Yeah.
Right. So
well, it is true that there is this kind of, like, even in our own group, we kind of like, well, in Comicsgate or indie comics, there is this kind of feeling of trepidation about using anything political within your stuff, because you don't want it to be propaganda. But then if you have an idea where it is an exploration of, well, what is politics? What does it do? What does it mean? How does it all work together? Then it kind of, you worry about that and you go, oh boy, I hope it works. I hope it works. Right. But some people might be like, I just want to escape. I'm sorry. And it's like, okay, you can.
Yeah. But even that escape, right, follows under this broad political definition, right? Because it's still character drama and implications and all that kind of stuff. And I think
machinations.
I think you bring up an important point about the difference between politics and propaganda, right?
I'm not so sure, though. You know, a lot of people say like, "Oh, well, propaganda's all evil," and I'm like, "Well, I don't know. Have we really explored that in depth? I should say."
Well, and I think a lot of it is people don't really know what propaganda is.
Yeah.
So most
What
people
is
define, most people define propaganda as a speech, political or otherwise, that they disagree with, right?
or it's lazy or it doesn't add to the story somehow. And that I think that's more of the issue that people feel. People
Yeah, and
want context when they're reading a story. They're trying to get what's the context of the people, the culture, how it feels. And because people sometimes use alternative stuff in order to explore those things, like especially in sci-fi, they do that a lot. Like if it's in the 50s, they're talking about the
Great point.
atomic age. A lot of people use it, but that's the thing that they're getting the subconscious stuff that's underneath. As an artist, what artists do is that they go way deep into the deep psychological places and try to understand. As long as it's an exploration versus this is the way something is. But that being said, I just recently watched a what was it? It was a Fletcher Superman movie, a little short, and
yeah,
that had it was Nazis. They were basically manipulating these natives into thinking they were gods, and they were wearing like these white robes and telling them what to do and that sort of thing. And Lois Lane gets shot down because she was a reporter there, and she gets captured and basically Superman comes and saves the day. And at the end of it, they said, "Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition." And you're just like, "Whoa, what is that?" And it was right after like Hitler was listening in, and then he just turns off the radio because he's so pissed that they won or something. But
wow.
there was something about that is just like, you know, on the one hand, you know, our modern sensibilities are like, wow, that's really jingoistic. But on the other hand, it's like, well, think about it. If you were opposing something so evil and you needed like language and words and psychological kind of moral, oh, that's it. Oh, damn it, I hate that. Moral,
Inspiration.
moral inspiration. No, morale,
Yeah.
moral morale in order to do what you needed to do. Because ultimately, on the one hand, America is best when she's kind of minding her own business. This is my own, like, speaking of politics, is when she's kind of minding her own business. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, we live in a world where everybody's decided to make us the police, and it's like, okay, we're gonna do that. All right, everybody's got to pay us. Oh, sorry, I live right across from a fire department, so if you need a minute, go ahead.
Yeah, and actually, that's what propaganda is, right? The Fleischer cartoon is an excellent example of propaganda. Because
Mhm.
all it is anytime you're presented with one side of the argument at the exclusion of opposing evidence, it's propaganda. Almost,
Right.
almost
Yeah.
every commercial, right, you see is propaganda, right?
It's
Right.
propaganda. That's all it
Right.
means. Right?
Well, propaganda, the word for it actually goes back to the Catholics, like really old, when they would propagate their philosophy of stuff. And but everybody does it, and that's you know, I think that's really where I feel kind of pissed is everybody's like, well, no, you know, we don't do it, we don't do it. It's like, hell yeah, everybody does it.
Yeah.
Just if you're honest about it, just be
Right.
honest about it. No one will care.
And
I
that's
think
actually
the people that are most upset about that sort of thing and use the term a lot and throw it around a lot against their enemies, I think
Mhm.
they're often the people that
The
use it
biggest
too.
propagandists ever.
Yeah. So
well, and I think sometimes what you have is you have a situation like look at our like mainstream media, right? Where they really only tend to present through editorial and everything else one side of an argument anyway. And
Hmm.
yeah.
massive amount of clout in terms of viewership and and venue and all that kind of stuff. And so you have other people that say, well, we're only going to present the other side of the argument because, there's so much presentation on the other side. Now,
Mm-hmm.
and the thing that gets really insidious is like in the UK, right? Their media outlets are pretty openly slanted, right? But they say, oh yeah, we're the right paper, we're the left paper, whatever. And so
Well,
right.
well,
But
it's kind of a problem when the government pays for your work.
Yeah.
It kind of taints it a little bit. I'm sorry.
that's a slightly different issue, but I know what you mean. But yeah, so whereas in America, the media outlets all pretend to be, unbiased, and every one of them is biased, right?
Yeah.
Unless you're listening to like Tim Pool or all the new media. New media, they'll tell you flat out what their issues are.
Well, in a lot of like your smaller outlets, like Fox News made no bones that it was right leaning sort of, which we talk about later. Yeah, the Daily Wire, the Daily Caller, the Breitbart, they all even MSNBC says we're a left wing outlet, but
Young turds.
Yeah.
CNN, you're a second crack. Lying about the fair and balanced. Okay. Anyway, but with that, there's that, and that's what propaganda is, though. Back to that subject, is that it's when you only present one side of an issue, right? And so when most people, I think, say they're sick of politics, what they really mean is that they're sick of partisan politics, or they're sick of propaganda, right? But because a lot of people don't know what propaganda is, right? What it really means. And I think a lot of people end up falling into the trap of participating in propaganda because they don't really know the difference on it.
Right. Not knowing what is propaganda is really hard because, well, we're not really trained, especially in public schools. We're not trained to do that. We're trained to consume propaganda, not to detect and to question it and to wonder, okay, what's going on here? What's going on? There's some BS going on here.
And pulling out those issues and questioning things is something that is a difficult thing to do, right? So, because it takes a lot of practice, takes a lot of discipline, blah, blah, blah. Well, anyway, so if, as I've said, that politics, right, is the affairs of men in society, right, then it comes down to the question of is that related to the study of philosophy, right, and our suppositional ideas and how we know things and what is truth and all that kind of stuff. Are those intrinsically and irrevocably connected ideas? And I would argue that they are, obviously so, right? I don't think there's any way around seeing politics writ large as anything but intrinsically philosophical, right?
Right.
What do you guys
Yeah, it's governed by philosophy. Yeah.
So then we have the question. So then, if we have that it's governed by philosophy, and of course, and I do bow to Claire's pragmatism, and I think that the way we know whether a political system works is the same way we know a philosophic system works, is if it actually works, right?
Yeah, it's no more like, let's try this one more time.
And that
Hopefully, we
actually
won't kill millions of people in the long going. And there goes yeah.
right.
It never
And that's one of
ends
those
well.
things that is sort of a discovery of a growth from the Greek thinkers and the big debate they had about what place thinking has in things and how do we apply those things. Then you look at Galileo and Newton that actually started testing the assumptions of the Greek philosophers in the physical sciences, right?
Right.
And so politics is the same way. You have the affairs of men in society, but you can map and you can track those things, and you can see how those machines and those those systems have intersected with each other. And so you have a connection between those ideas, but still the concept of individualism versus collectivism, right? Of rule by the individual, of his own actions and his own thought, and the idea of rule by governing forces and those that know better are still in play within the concept of looking at a broader philosophy. So,
Right. It's hard.
So anyway,
There's that balance between the two that needs to happen, ultimately.
Well, I think one of the things that we have there is that the real world is our testing ground for a lot of those sort of things.
Right.
It's like, the whole concept of, to pick another hot topic, the idea of gender equality, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, you can say that, that there's no substantive difference between men and women until you start having arm wrestling competitions, right?
Or
very guy way to
or how long they can work without getting sick, and how long they can. It depends, and it can be the difference between each other too. It's not like something ridiculous where okay, a woman can never do, because some women aren't. Some women are not. They're not maternal. They're not whatever, and work is probably the best place where they can do their best and really change the world. Or if they're like a super genius and their whole life is focused around curing, like finding cures and stuff like that. There's a different thing, and that's the same. It can be an all-consuming thing where they have to actually fix things and change stuff as well. So there is that flux in between, and so that's probably why I tend to lean more towards the independent one, is because it gives enough freedom over than security. Although I do have something to think about, like when it comes to more collective stuff, it can work, but it tends to work best in places that are monoculture. So like if you have a co-op with mostly liberal, like-minded liberal people, or you have a church, or you have families. Those are the three places where I've seen it actually work. Or if it's in a country, it's in a monoculture like Japan. There's something, you have to give something up in order to get something else. So a monoculture like Japan or other places, they may have their own like individual differences, but they have to go underneath. There's something that it clicks and it makes sense for people. So even within this kind of collectivist versus individualist, there is, even in between there's like these somewhat grays. But I guess that's why we have states, because states are the way we can kind of be laboratories of seeing what the heck goes on.
And they're voluntarist laboratories, right? So those kind of those cohesion mechanisms you're talking about in cultures, those are things that we discover, I guess, through observation, because they naturally arise. And learning,
unless you have Californians who keep moving the frick around, and then ruining places wherever they go. I'm sorry, I have problems.
So yeah.
So back up just a little bit to what you talked about earlier. We're talking about that, not all men and not all women fit into a monolith, right?
Sorry, I kind of went off on a tangent.
No, that's fine. All good stuff and all stuff I want to talk about. But that men and women don't fit into a monolith, because you do have women that are not caregivers, or you have women that are more physically able than other women, and you have men that are not as physically able and are not protectors because of whatever issues they have, and that's true, right? But that exception to the rule, hello metal, that exception to the rule actually reinforces the concept of individualism, right? Because these, once again, I was talking about the predictable derivations in a system, right? And we have a system, the human race, that has these derivations from it, are still part of the collective whole, but don't fit the standard norms. Right? And so with
it's
that,
okay.
if we had strict, inflexible gender roles that could never work, right? Suddenly you have men that aren't fit because of disease, because of strength of mind, because of keenness of eyesight, they're not fit to go hunt, right? They don't have the stamina to be out under the sun. They're prone to getting cancers, whatever they are, right? They've got to work indoors. And of course, in the modern world, we've developed most of our jobs to be indoors. But imagine that we have a situation where these men don't fit into this traditional tribal gender role. Are they not men? Right? So there is an flexibility in the concept of the individual-based society that fits with that worldview that I'm proposing and espousing, that doesn't fit within the collectivist mindset, right?
Because the collectivist view would say they would answer and they'd say, no, those aren't men. We have no use for them collectively.
Right.
So
right, and that's actually, and if you look at the dialogue as by the socialists, Marx and Engel and Stalin and Hitler and all of his crew and Mussolini and all of their guys, those socialists, those fascists, they had no use for men that would not be traditional men. They had no use for women that would not bear children, right?
yeah.
If you're not going to have kids, let's get you sterilized. Let's put you on a farm till you die because you're using too much food for the workers. And so we have that heavily collectivist mindset that ruled by the experts would say you don't fit this mold, so you're invalid, right? So and we're looking at within that context, and so that was one thing. So if you're looking at the fact that yeah, there are definite differences between men and women, and although not all men fit into that category, not all women fit into that category, they still are within the range of what makes up men and women, right? And so that's one of the things.
Yeah, it just kind of broadens what the definition of women and men manifestly are, I guess, is what.
And I don't think
looking at that range, which is nice.
Well, and I don't think that it actually broadens the definition. I think that what it does is it solidifies that definition, because what really makes the definition, right? It's not behavior, right? It's being, right? And those being, as defined by those chromosomes, right, is very fixed. And of course, you have people that fit into the genetic anomaly, double XY chromosome setups.
Oh, you mean intersex?
Yeah, intersex. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a couple of different variations that fit under intersex. But once you understand the genetic machinery, they still are predictable derivations from the system.
The
same way
right.
You were talking about cultural man and womanhood, I guess. I was
right. But I'm saying cultural man and womanhood has, because we're looking at, remember, if a culture and a philosophy has root, right? From my perspective, it has to match the real world, right? And so one of the things we see in the physical world is that those genetic components, they have a derivation, just like our societal expectation has a derivation. It has a range of things that we can adapt and grow and understanding that doesn't change the fundamental premises of that belief, of that philosophy.
Yeah, I guess the only reason I bring up the distinction between cultural, like woman and manhood, versus genetic is I think it's important to try and figure out an individualistic framework that doesn't assume like a cultural bent to how these things are defined. Do you know what I mean?
Right. And I think that's kind of been the argument that's been going on quite a bit, is about is actually between people who are looking at the biology versus the cultural baggage, I guess is a way to put that.
Okay.
And it's weird because I think that's where you get a lot of like the confusion. If you don't fit 100% in, now everybody's like, oh, you should get chemicals and stuff because, oh, you might be something else. When in reality, sometimes it's something else entirely, where people are so quick to kind of get the knife when really they should just chill for a bit and then let the kid figure out what they want to do. And then they find that either they kind of settle in or do whatever. And people who don't settle in, there's still options to do that. And actually, well, to be fair to a lot of trans people, they're just trying. The normie trans are just trying to be normal. They're sort of like, I'm trying to blend in. I'm a chameleon. Please leave me alone. And trans trenders who just want attention, and everybody does that.
Right. And so in the nature of looking at trans and societal expectations, right, how does that the concept of the individual society, of the individual man, right, of the individual being pristine?
Well, it could go both ways, I guess, because you could hypothetically say, well, if you can define what it is for yourself, and this could be like, it could go from just trans people, it could also go into non-binary, because you have defined for yourself, okay, this is what I'm going to do for myself. I'm going to conform myself to something because this is closer to what my brain is processing.
Or what we believe our brains are processing.
Right, exactly.
I will say one thing I've always been skeptical about the statement. I've just always felt like X.
Right. Like, why do you feel that way?
And that's a cultural statement, right? It's not a biological statement.
Well, it's not just
a psychological statement. But
it's not just a cultural statement, right? It's a heavily presumptive statement, because if a man says, "I've always felt like a woman," how could he possibly know that?
Yeah.
And like I have two rules. I have two rules of questions when it comes to questioning information, right? And they are they are quotes from various pop culture media that I think isolate important questions. One is from Darby Connolly's "Get Fuzzy," and the statement is, "You seem awfully sure for somebody who just got here." Right?
Yeah.
And we have a lot of things.
Talking about kids.
Right. He's actually talking about a cat. There's a cat who is caught in the middle of some sort of dastardly. Get Fuzzy is about a man and his two pets. It's like Garfield, but twisted around funny. It's the Garfield formula, but it's turned on its head.
Oh, okay.
The Siamese cat gets caught in the middle of some sort of mischief. And Rob, the human owner, says, "What are you doing with X?" And the cat says, "You seem awfully sure about that for somebody who just got here." And we make all these presumptions about things based upon our assumptions about things. And so that's one of the questions that I have on there, right? Are our assumptions actually rooted in fact, or are they simply the way we think they ought to be? That's question one about questioning evidence. My second question about questioning evidence is from Napoleon Dynamite. When Kip Dynamite says, "Like anyone could even know that, Napoleon." and the reason that's a question for me is that there are many things in the world that we presume have to be this way or that way, but the actual ability, the epistemological ability to know that is in question. Right? Can you even know this, right? And so when I hear somebody say, "I've always felt, black," right? Possibly know what that's like.
We're going there.
This is great.
Going there.
You could say,
which is a cultural thing.
Right.
They think they're making a racial statement, but they're making a cultural statement.
Yes. And it's a cultural statement that's rooted in an assumption about an experience that they can't possibly have had.
Yeah. Because they can have, that's the thing, they can have cultural
Similar
experiences,
things.
but they,
Or similar
a lot
Whereas
closer.
parallel-
They can't have a biological experience. But,
Right. And even their cultural experience is still going to be very limited because it's rooted in your understanding, not in the understanding of the thing you're attaching yourself to.
yeah.
Well, you think about it though, it kind of makes it interesting why we do have cultural studies then, because there is something that we can't do that, or we can't really understand.
So
So should we
here's
like experience this, like where they talk
they're
about
kind
like
of
the
breaking
black
down,
experiences
I think, in
versus they are?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're just becoming. It's not opportunities for people to learn from each other. I mean, I was in school like a decade ago, and there was the beginnings of this, and it was more
Oh,
about the study
yeah.
of being
So now here
being
becomes
taught to think
here's
differently.
the break in the rule to the question of how can anybody even know that, right? Because there's a difference between experienced knowledge and, for the lack of a better term, absorbed knowledge, right?
Hmm.
I will never understand what it was like to go through the Civil War personally, right? But in studying and reading letters from people, in the fact that I am a human being and have emotions, I can have an empathic reaction to events that happened in the Civil War, right? We can
Right.
imagine ourselves there, and it's not an exact thing, right? But it's the way those events have influenced us is still the way we're being influenced. But my thing is that it's a danger to directly apply another person's experience to ours as though it was our experience, right? And so
Yeah, that's fair.
that comes that question of epistemology and how is all that all going to work out, and we got to take a step back and say, okay, this is what I'm getting from that, but that doesn't necessarily mean what it means to me, right? Now we have language, and it's amazing in our ability to communicate those interperson things to other people, and because we've had similar experiences and we are all human, there is a common language of the heart that I think that we speak, but to assume it's a one-to-one thing, right? Which a lot of people do. That's where I think we run into a real problem with that. Which
Yeah.
then,
Well, or we feel like we have to. Let me say this: we feel like we have to, or else if we see eye to eye, then that leads to a conflict where people kill each other. I hate to like go right to that, but at the same time, it's not that far from our history,
It's
really.
identity versus identity at that point, and
here's
or
one
an
of the
existential
issues
threat.
that comes with the assumption that we can, because I think that with the danger, this comes back to our idea, right? With the assumption that we can understand another person's experience, right? And a lot of people put that forward in the egalitarian ideas and a lot of those philosophies. Um, they make the assumption, and then when somebody stops and says, "Wait, you've never had my experience. You never grew up where I did. You never saw the things I did. You didn't live in my family." We have this because we've come from a place of assuming we can understand, and then seeing that maybe we can't understand, right? Then the next assumption is that then there can't be middle ground between peoples and places and cultures and ideas, right?
Yeah.
And you can't speak to the Black experience, and so whatever you say about our role in society isn't valid, right? You can't, and that's an argument that gets bandied around that I've seen quite. People say because you've never been X, you can't understand Y, right? But if we have an individualist perspective, right? I mean, back to my thesis. If we have an individualist perspective where we assume that the things that we do and the places we go and the ideas that we have are unique to us from the get-go, right? You don't have to understand another person's experience, understand another person's place in society, because your place in society isn't built upon your experience. Your place in society is built upon how you impact the lives of other people, right? It's an outside, inside out view of human relationships.
Hmm.
And so
That's
when we're looking at this thing from a political perspective, it's not about why you punch someone else in the mouth. It's that you punch somebody else in the mouth, right?
Oh man, Ayn Rand, heat your heart out. This is getting good.
I need to read more from her a little bit. We really should have got a War Pick. I don't know if you've seen his Twitter around. I haven't seen his in a while. I don't know if he's like disappeared or not, but he's like he's definitely like a straight up objectionist, and I love it. I'm like, yes, because you don't get to see those very often.
My biggest problem with objectivism is that because it's so rooted, and I think it shares one fundamental flaw with libertarian thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the fundamental flaw that it has is that it misunderstands an important aspect of.
Wait. I just want to say I don't know if he actually is an objectivist. I don't know what framework he is well enough, but I get the vibe. So just if you're listening, War Pick, you can comment in the bottoms below. And anyway,
Okay.
I'm just saying, okay? I don't want to step on people's toes.
Screen here. Metal says, how does anyone have trouble understanding experience? It's just a bunch of numbers, and when you get enough, you hit the next level.
Oh my gosh. Isn't that the way it goes?
What's the big deal?
At some point, yeah. At some point, there is kind of a, well, this is all bullshit, and let's just get to the point.
Right. But anyway, so what I was saying, I think my problem with the objectivist idea, my problem with the libertarian idea is like it misses an important aspect, which is under libertarian thinking, the fundamental building block of society, right? The indivisible unit upon which society is built is the individual. Okay, so individual rights under the libertarian idea trump all else because it's the fundamental building block of society. I don't disagree with that, but I don't think it's complete because the family unit is also the individual building block of the indivisible building block of society. The husband and wife unit are the indivisible building block of society because that's where citizens come from, right? So individual rights can't trump rights in that unit, right? And it's not a collectivist idea because it's completely voluntary, right? But it's the fact that you do have an identity that transcends your individual identity when you're in a family, and that is the machine that generates citizens. And so both of those things, the sanctity of the individual and the sanctity of the family, have to be preserved in order for society to continue. And that's one of those things that I think that a lot of
it doesn't last as long because unfortunately the issue that I think a lot of libertarians are kind of having to overcome is it's not the future, and it seems like they kind of get like a little sidetracked by other stuff, which is well, I'm not talking about weed this time. I'm actually talking about a lot of them kind of go to the status like Tulsi or something, and I'm like, what the heck? What? I'm just confused.
I'm sorry, no, I missed the last thing.
Oh, well, it seemed like a lot of them tend to go statist anyway. Well, they tend to be like either center left or then they end up reverting to the state again, unless they're hardcore and they just are
and
like, no.
And that actually is something I want to get to in a little while before we hit the religion thing, before we get too far afield with that. It's definitely an issue. And I think there's a specific reason for that people forget. Because like I think the fundamental problem we have is are we individual units or are we collectivist units? Are we just part of society, or are we in fact a society unto ourselves? And with the idea that we're looking at the individual and the family as being tandem concepts. Right?
I will say societies are kind of like that, but not really, very loosely. It depends what type of culture you have. Like I could see, for example, like again, I bring up Japan again, but that's a very monoculture like that. That's where it's an extended sort of family where they feel comfortable to sell alcohol without worried about underage people getting it out of the vending machines because they know that adults will go up and be like, "What are you doing? You're not supposed to be drinking that. What are you doing?" They know somebody's going to regulate on deck. Again, those are where it's smaller, egalitarian. That's where the society does that. But that's the weird part because it seems like you can't get one with the other. That's always what I thought is weird about the diversity push within that too, because it seems like you want a monoculture anyway. Why do you keep pushing the diversity thing? That's intuitive.
Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, the whole diversity push is misaligned anyway, and I think it's actually intended to spread.
It's a Trojan horse.
It really was. I think it was intended to sow confusion.
And in some way, it's going to bite them in the ass so hard, especially when it comes to like all the Muslim immigrants that they keep importing. And I'm not getting this from like weird whack job. This is from where is it? Imam of Peace, Imam Tahiti. And he used to be radical. Now he's calmed down and he's like, okay, you gotta. His thing is like encouraging people to de-radicalize themselves. So he kind of does the individualist thing, but he says the difference between liberals and traditional Muslims or like radical Muslims is that they think in generations. They don't think in 4-year gaps. So they know if they just vote enough bad politics and haram things going on, they just know we're just going to outproduce all these, we'll have 4 wives to their 1, and we can outbreed them basically. And by the time generations have gone by, we'll take over. And other Muslims who are mild and don't want things, they're like, oh no, these weirdos have come out.
So anyway, back to I think part of what the medal was getting at is something that I agree is we're not just talking about families in a healthy sense. The dynamics, the political dynamics we learn within families end up getting spread into society around us by proxy. And so the idea that you have the family, the tribe, the nation, that's the way every country in the world existed before America. Those dynamics didn't stop existing just because our nation is built upon a concept rather than a reading populace. And so I think that's why, because family dynamics are intrinsically related to individual dynamics and all that kind of stuff, under my particular worldview, that's why when we have a misunderstanding of the philosophy of the individual and a misunderstanding philosophy of a family, is going to lead to a misunderstanding of the philosophy of governance, which is where we end up with reverting toward this statist concept, because we replace the family we didn't have for government we can have, instead of the family being an engine for creating the individual.
Well, because in the end, governments don't have wombs. Like, yeah, I think I feel this more particularly because I am pregnant and I am going through that. My body is literally transforming into something, just a different critter. I'm not the same person being pregnant before I was pregnant. Your body is changing so much in order to form this this child, and so the state can't do that. There's something the state can facilitate. It can get things going, I do want to make one point too, while we're still talking about religion, politics, and everything else, is that in America, they did have that separation of church and state, but really it was about making sure no one church took over the whole thing, because that was just too much power for one church. But they, at the same time, they were very collaborative with churches. They would actually give money to churches because churches would be the schoolhouse. They would facilitate, and there was this collaborative thing between each other. It wasn't as antagonistic as it is now because the church got lazy and didn't do anything. I blame the church because we know better.
Well, and I think that's part of it. And I think the other aspect of it, and this is something that I think is true, but I would not be 100% certain on. One of the things that happened back in the 1950s, right, was that there's a huge boom in fraternal organizations, right? The Kiwanis, the Rotary, the Eagles, the Moose Lodge, all these kind of things. And these fraternal
Illuminati. I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself. Go ahead.
These fraternal organizations would be places where people would get together and do public benefits. Now, there was some unsavory stuff that happened in some of them, but by and large, they were just a way that businessmen could get together to make their communities a little different, a little better sometimes, right? And one of the interesting things about that is that in a lot of ways, that is what, churches were supposed to be doing. And so some people say, well, it's because churches weren't doing them. I actually think that's not the case. And the people that I've met in my life that have been involved in fraternal organizations, almost all of them are church people.
Yeah, they're nerds to begin with.
But the church that I'm talking about, I'm talking about that these people are people that go to church and then they act out their faith by collecting money through Kiwanis or whatever, right? And so they're involved in all these charitable organizations and doing all this benefit and feeding the hungry and all this kind of stuff, but they're not doing it as Baptists and they're not doing it as Episcopalians. They're doing it as, whatever else.
Can I interject? Okay, this could be wrong entirely, but my view, my assumption was we had a whole generation of dudes going to war, and then their kids' generation went, all those sons went to war, and I'm assuming that was a component. I don't know if it's a coincidence, but that camaraderie, that male camaraderie for two generations was such a big deal to them, and they didn't have an equivalent to find, or they would appreciate the more they could find, the better, Yeah. So coming up with these kind of
clubs, actually, that's true because my mom grew up in that era, well, the tail end of the baby boomers, but that was true. Men bonded over the bar. They would rather go to the bar and hang out with their friends because they were still processing a lot of all the crap that went on, and what and they couldn't really be like that sort of thing. So a lot of, not all, but a lot of them did still had to overcome that, and it's a hard thing if you think about it.
Yeah.
Well, I definitely think that there is definitely an element of that survivorship. I mean, W's, American Legion are also part of that whole milieu, right?
The fraternity as well, right?
So and so those are definitely considerations in all of that too. But I just know it, and maybe it's because I'm born in the 70s, grew up in the 80s. I'm separated from a lot of that kind of stuff. But just to say from my experience, the people I know that are involved in the Rotary Club and in the VFW and those sort of things are people that were by and large church folks and found ways of serving people through their fraternal organizations. And I don't think that was necessarily
it's not a zero sum for sure.
Exactly. And I think that one of the things that so much of the things that, and it's, this gets to be a personal issue of mine. Like a lot of people throughout the years have accused the church of not doing the business of the church, of feeding widows and orphans and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, widows and orphans are constantly getting fed by people of the church, right? The Catholic and Episcopalian and Methodist hospitals were sprung up all over this world in the last 100 years. America,
And there is, I would say, there also is an effort to get the church out of those things as well. If you notice how they've gone hard in the paint against Salvation Army, even though that is the most efficient and least, like, the guy who's in charge of it he actually doesn't even have a salary, but everybody's all huffy and puffy about some of their policies and all this other stuff. And it's like, well, it depends. I mean, it's one thing if stuff and you're just like, donating to certain campaigns and you're like, I don't know, like, right or left, doesn't matter. If you don't feel comfortable about doing that, don't do it. But there is especially in the 50s, there was that kind of feeling of, trying to push the church out, because there was a very real communist thing. Okay, you teased this before, and I'm going to say it, and I'm going to say it now.
We went everywhere
McCarthy
else.
did
We might as well.
nothing wrong. McCarthy did nothing wrong. I said it.
So here's what McCarthy did wrong. Okay. What did he do wrong? It's a very specific thing McCarthy did wrong. What McCarthy did wrong is that he pretended he had information he didn't have, and in doing so, actually played into the communist plot. Because
of course,
he had a list, and he would shake it around, and there was nothing in the list ever. And so the actual communists got away with it entirely, were able to write the narrative, infiltrated the academy, did everything to screw up America in the 60s and 70s, because they got under the radar in the 50s, because McCarthy didn't actually have any information.
Well, that's interesting you talk about that, because I was just listening to speaking of gay people, Milo. He had another conversation with Jordan Peterson, and it's really good. He just kind of is just on fire. But he talked about, because he got in trouble because he talked about his own experience with sex abuse as a kid, and his whole thing was more about, he didn't see it as abuse at the time. And now he's married with a guy who has a son, and he explained how, now I understood what that was. And he said, if that happened to my stepson, I would kill that guy and throw his body in the ocean. But also, he wrote a book called Diabolical, and he was talking about how within the Catholic Church, he calls it the Lavender Mafia.
Yeah.
And it's so it's not just basically the gay priests, but it's also the progressive priests. And a lot of them were the ones kind of responsible for all the cover up for child abuse. And you notice they keep a really tight lid on it. And he said the reason why that was because they felt like they were doing something bad because they were often openly gay, or within their own, cloister, you should say. They were in the cloister. And so then they felt like, I can't say something bad because I'm engaging in something bad here. So then it would attract other people to come into it, and then it became weird after a while. But it just was really interesting, and it was funny because I heard that, and his whole thing was, what it did was it pushed men, real manhood. People want to go to church because they want the fire and brimstone. They want, and they want someone to say no further. So there you go.
Yeah.
But I thought it was really
And that's
interesting, and I was like,
actually,
oh, go ahead. So hot.
well, I think actually comes back to the premise, right? That if the world fits a certain standard of design, right, that if we're part of that design, we would intrinsically want that design reinforced, right? So we understand where our standards and boundaries and rules are because we see those things being reflected within society. And I think that the issue of fatherhood being excluded from the church and from society as a whole are things that are unintended breakdown of the concept of our family structure and our individuality and how those things tie in together. I think it was done intentionally to debase the standalone, the independent unit of the independence of the American people, right?
And I
Because
want to say something
all of these things are
about
connected.
American Family really quick. That the American Family was unique because they became their own little pods. Although some did have extended family, but what it did was it kind of undercut a lot of the um, kind of the nepotism that would sometimes happen if everybody was all crammed in one place, like in Europe, where okay, your brother just does it, and your brother learns a trade and does the same thing. Whereas kind of that separation, it kind of did something interesting. Although some people, like Camellia Paglia, argues maybe that made people more neurotic instead. Because that was her experience, because she lived with her extended family, and she thought it was interesting because they had that really segregated, because it was an Italian family, and the moms and they would all the women would cook and do chores, and everybody would come together at mealtime, like Christmas or whatever. But then once they were gone, they went back to their own corners. Women would clean up, the guys would go outside and try to fix a car and do that. And she was observing this as a young girl, but just that there was that kind of segregation though. So I'm not sure if extended family is to blame, or if it's too nuclear, maybe, but I don't know. That's
Well, I
just a
don't think
weird
those
thought.
things are exclusive either. I think that's one of the things that I think people assume too much about stuff like that because I don't think that they're necessarily or intrinsically uh, separate. I think they can work in tandem and often do very well. People just forget about it, I think.
Well, we also don't have as many people, just doing their thing and, trying to be like, yo, what are you doing with your life?
Can I ask a question? So you guys have me thinking. You're talking about we have to define things a little more collectively than just individuals, and you're talking about the family structure. And if the families, so the reason why I'm hesitant, and I am a little more libertarian leaning, the reason why I'm hesitant to go with a family structure like subunit as fundamental is that we're entering an age where family units have largely broken down. Whether they, I mean, a lot of people still have families, but it's not a structured family. You know what I mean? Relative to previous times, but there's still a culture at play. And we can say it's a sick or it's a less effective culture, but it's still there. And there's still people participating in politics in the public sphere. People are still surviving. So I'm thinking that, I mean, it's almost like, I think the family structure is pretty fantastic, but I don't think it's necessary because we're still doing culture today, and most people don't have family on the level that, at least in America, that I would say that on the level that people used to think of family even a generation or two ago. Do you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
I'll give you
Matt,
the
I'm
thing.
curious. I have a question.
Yeah.
What was your family structure like growing up?
I was close with my mom. I had a couple of on the end of the boomer, the youngest boomer kind of, hippie boomers, I guess.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I
That's
had
my
a
mom.
yeah, I had a fairly not present father with whom I've never gotten along at all with. He didn't really raise us, and I have one sister with whom I got along. So I think it was a fairly dysfunctional family, and it was one that wouldn't have been able to persist in previous generations. I think it was considered liberal and progressive or something enough to be normative, I guess, for that generation. And
Right.
then I guess I'm just saying that norms are shifting, and I can say I think they're unhealthy shifts, but and I can even say they're dysfunctional, but I I think
Do you
I think
feel
we
So
can
here,
break things down
do you,
beyond just the family.
right.
so here's where I come down on something like that, right? Like just because norms shift, right, doesn't mean that they're functional.
Or
Right?
that they're permanent either.
Exactly.
Yeah. No.
Um,
Yeah.
so one of the things I'm talking about here is if we are looking at society, this is my presumption, right? That if society is actually a machine, right, a machine for building humans, right, then
Yeah.
what we have is that some systems will work and some will not, right? And
Survival of the fittest.
just because norms are shifting doesn't mean that they're producing humans that are going to continue, right?
Yeah.
Mm,
I think
yeah.
you're already getting a little too statist, maybe, for my liking.
Yeah.
They're
That's the thing is like
not there for building. I don't know.
right,
I think society's
like
there for
the
helping
destruction,
the individuals to flourish, not necessarily to allow them to flourish, I guess.
right, and that's the ticket, right? Is the allowance to
Yeah,
flourish.
not to build them into flourishing.
Exactly. And so there's a difference, and here's one of the breakdowns that I'm talking about too. There's a difference between the analog structure of what I believe is the analog structure of the universe, right? With the idea that that needs to be mandated and controlled by government, right?
Yeah.
Our current society is actually built to break families. And that's on a governmental level. It is discouraging to create families. It is discouraging to maintain them. You have an entire
Yeah,
structure
I'd
that
say that.
I would
defather.
caveat, call it I disincentivize would be the
Yes.
word I would use.
Yeah, I think that's entirely fair. We are disincentivized, and I think Me Too is part of it because although that only became like a meme recently, it's been an issue for decades.
And sex robots might be a thing coming up.
Oh, it's
Oh,
all.
Yeah.
It's already there.
It's been happening for a long time. It's just people weren't talking about it.
Yeah, that it's those sort of things that make me think. If we're just if we're trying to come up with definitions, I mean, are we just trying to come up with qualitative definitions? And I'm fine with that. But if we're just trying to come up with definitions based on observation, I think there's a lot of unhealthy cultures that persist for hundreds of years in unhealthy ways. You know what I mean? And ours could be one of them. I don't know. We'll see how.
I think there's some definite elements of that, but I think when we get to the point of that with the current system we're looking at, one of the things that is that becomes profoundly un-American, and that's part of my
Okay.
part of it, because when you have a culture that encourages, because I'm not talking about a government, I'm talking about a culture that encourages the sex robot. You have a culture that has dehumanized its citizens.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at that point, America is un-American. I mean, which I feel like it kind of is already. But
I mean, there's pockets of it that exist.
yeah,
I know that because I live in Nebraska.
yeah, you guys are all right. I've seen your senator. He's a good guy.
Parts of us are all right. We're and that's the thing is but the thing is parts of us are all right simply because we're unaware that there are other options, and there are people that that they're just so stuck in the way they are that they haven't, woken up to the realization that there are sex robots.
Come down to Florida.
Or-
It's pretty crazy.
And there's me. I'm stuck in Washington State, and good Lord, it's kind of it still has half a brain compared to the rest of the West Coast.
Yeah,
in a weird way.
Yeah.
Mostly because everybody else there's still this pioneer thing, and I think it's because we're closer to like Alaska. We're kind of the last one. We were kind of progressive to begin with because we gave women the vote right away. But it was also there is this self kind of reliance sort of bent that's there. It's hard to explain. But we also read a lot and we do that. And unlike San Francisco that has all the crap that's going on, our own media is bringing it to attention and trying to say what's going on here, especially on the outer parts of it. The further away you get from Seattle, let me put it that way.
Yeah.
Seattle's just kind of becoming a crap hole, literally.
Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah. But Washington State, yeah, I do love that pioneer spirit. Like, I feel like y'all have a lot of hardy, and even in Oregon too, just, maybe away from some of the more infamous cities.
They're more crunchy, and it's kind of flat. Yeah. I feel like maybe in Washington, maybe the terrain's just a slight bit rougher than Oregon. I don't know what it is about Oregon compared to Washington, but there is a difference. I can't
and I'll
explain.
tell you right now that concept of the pioneer spirit, why that's such a thing is because that is individualism, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And there's that family structure you're talking about too.
Well, this is the thing that I want to go on about, right? So like a little bit. So I talk about like my grandparents, my great grandfather came here from Wales on a boat in 1872, right? And they didn't have, his father had come into Boston in 71 and lived in a tenement in Southie and worked in the shipyards. They didn't come for a silver spoon. They came for the chance to pull a living out of the earth. You know what I mean? And that's what they did. They paid money, homesteaded to Kansas, no guarantee of survival, and they took the Kansas soil and turned it into a living. You know what I mean?
Beautiful.
His son, my great grandfather, and their
beautiful.
And his family homesteaded in the next generation to Wyoming, and made something out of that, And so what you have is you had it. They worked as a family and they had to because that's how you survive. That's one of those elements. I think that why I point to the family being important is because it's where the individual comes from, right?
Literally.
And I don't think literally and figuratively, but I don't think that's something that the government needs to have their nose in anything other than allowing to exist, not.
And if there is legitimate abuse, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
If you want blood in the streets, man, there's like a bunch of like Antifa saying they want to call CPS on people because if they're MAGA people, that they should call CPS on them. And I'm like, dude, if you do that, people will die. I'm sorry. You do not separate them from their children. And they have the gun.
Didn't someone just get does Washington have the red what do you call it? The redlining the gun thing going on?
Red flag laws.
Yeah, red flag.
Red flag. I think there is some, but I don't think they passed a lot to do with it. But I wouldn't be surprised if they have. It's hard because on the one hand, it's like shall not be infringed is kind of a big deal, but I mean, I think I'm more worried about people committing suicide with the gun instead of going out and shooting other people.
Yeah, that's more common. Yeah.
And that's weird that they don't talk about that as much at all.
Well, and the reason they don't is because the statistics are pretty clear that
Mm-hmm.
if somebody tries to commit suicide with a gun and then you take the gun away from them, that doesn't stop them from trying to commit suicide.
Right. They'll just find some other means to do it.
And that's a discouraging fact, but it is one of those things.
Well, I mean, especially if you got Me Too, like that developer from Zoe Quinn.
Yeah, I don't know
Yeah.
enough about to have an
That was
opinion.
horrible.
Oh, it was awful. Yeah. Well, and add insult to injury in where it happened is in Manitoba, and they have no limit of what was it? They have no statute of limits for that particular type of crime of what she accused him of. So there was no reason for her to do it. Yeah, that's true. Like someone looked it up just to see. And I think it was because a bunch of Nazis were going up and hiding in Canada. So they took away a ton of their statute of limitations just to combat that. So a lot of crimes you can get it it's a pretty rudy thing, especially if you kidnapped, because that's what she said. Oh, he kept me there for a
That
month.
was strange.
And
Yeah.
and it was weird was people looked at her Twitter timeline and when she roughly said it, and she said, "Oh, I'm in Toronto and I'll be here for a couple of hours." That was all she said on Twitter. Now, granted, not everyone puts everything on Twitter, but she did run off with $90,000 and nothing happened. So,
Yeah.
if you decide to meet two people, I'm sorry, your credibility is on the line. Like, it'd be one thing if it was someone who is like a very credible person who has a very good reputation and they've exhausted everything. Like they've tried to work through the law, they've tried everything they could possibly do to exhaust every possibility. And after they've done everything that they could legally do, then go on Twitter. Okay, I could hypothetically see that. And especially if they already have like a good reputation to begin with. But there has to be some kind of rule though that if you bring it in the court of opinion, you don't get the protections of the court of law. Something to that effect. That people can criticize you, they can say, "Okay, you're crazy," and it shouldn't be a crime, or "I don't believe you." Something like that. I know that sounds like a weird tangent to go off, but anyway, go ahead.
Well, I mean, when it comes down to it, I wouldn't say that eliminate legal protections just because I think that legal protections are such a big deal. But I definitely see where you're coming from is the idea that there is we need to have a high, maybe a different standard for what's considered like libel, and like that's one of the things. There used to be a lighter standard for what counted as libel, and for some reason, and I don't really know the history of that.
Well, you have things like fighting words, which is like you can't incite someone to try to pick on you or something. So it's not. Yeah, in some states, yes, that's true. Like Texas, where everyone ran their mouths, and now they're all getting sued. Ah, Texas.
In Nebraska, like there are we have a law. It's called fight by mutual consent. So if you're involved in a physical altercation at all, and if you strike back, it's considered fight by mutual consent, and there's not a legal protection for you here. Which I'm not particularly in favor of, being, one of the homes of the Old West. You can't get into a good bar fight here without going to jail. Doesn't seem to make sense to me.
That just sounds like they're just getting all up in your business, and at that point, you go, "F you."
It's about enough to make me hop the border, but I work in Nebraska, so I don't want to drive, a half hour every day. Sure.
Well, it's all important. I'm sorry, I keep interrupting, but
anyway, we've got a little far afield here, so let's
Let's try to get to the end first, and then like get to your hypothesis, and then we can kind of spiral out from there.
Yeah. So, sorry, 9:15. So we've talked about the intrinsic linking between, in many ways, philosophy and politics, and the nature of governance, right? The idea of the individual versus the group. And my third thesis is that religion is tied into all of that as well, right? And the reason that I hold that opinion is because philosophy is, of course, the rules by which we reason and think, right? Science is the study of the natural world. Politics is the study of our human relationships and interactions. And religion is the study of everything we know has to exist, but does not fit into the physical world, right? It's a way that we make sense of the fact that we live transcendent lives, right? The idea that there are some truths that are outside of our physical reality that we have to take on faith because that's how the world's put together, right? So a coherent religious philosophy would include ideas like, why is there music? Why, how do we have emotions and feelings? Are we more than just, meat sacks walking around following our chemical urges? Are we in fact thinking beings? And all of those are actually religious questions because they relate to things that transcend our physical reality. Would anybody disagree with that?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that people don't consider to be physical, but aren't necessarily religious in concept, I'd say. Like
Or
math,
like people in denial.
or yeah. I mean, there's a lot of cultures that believe in like non-physical stuff that
So, okay, math is actually a really good consideration.
You know
I
what I
got a
mean?
good one. Someone said emotions don't transcend physical reality. That's an interesting thought.
Yeah, it's debatable. Yeah.
Maybe not emotions, but I think like for me, the things that always stick out to me is about fairness. Because fairness, I think, is one of those weird things where, oh, that's not fair. And it's like, what's the logic behind that? Why would something be fair to you and not here? There has to be something outside of you that is judging and observing at that point.
Yeah.
So to the questions that do not transcend our physical reality, I would like you to go bring me a cup of emotions, exactly one cup, and then we can have that conversation.
Exactly one cup. What? Pure salt?
Yeah.
Pure salt. Salt mine. Here's some salt. I got some absolute bitterness from the cat lady from across the way.
Of course, emotions transcend.
That was terrible.
The salt. That's funny though. I appreciate the funny. But I said, of course, what I was saying, of course, emotions transcend our physical reality because we can't touch, hold, or measure them. And even if you're looking at, the emotions are simply reactions of our brain chemistry. First of all, that's not proven, and second of all, when you get down to that, which came first, the emotion or the chemical reaction?
And also, you think about too, like there's different brains in our body as well. Like if you look actually into science, it kind of does something. It doesn't necessarily prove stuff, but it does offer questions. Like it makes me think of like we have our brain here, but also our heart itself has a brain, and our lower intestines is like a different brain as well, and that's like our guts or like your gut intuition, almost your intuition, and that's kind of like always looking around, kind of like, what's going on here? But it's like different where places of the heart where you feel it in your body. I don't know. I lost my train of thought. Dang it. Oh, wow. I had a thought and I lost it. Oh, wow. But that the heart can actually feel these things and can do that. I don't know. I think just people just don't want to have to deal with God and all this other crap. And it's like, I get it. On the one hand, it's like you'd rather just do whatever. Oh, no. That's not fair, though, because there's a lot of people that work really hard. They really want to understand it, and they just feel like they can't. There's like a block there, and they can't comprehend it, and it's really frustrating for them. So that's not fair. And then there's poor people like Stefan Molyneux, who's working to build a whole thing from scratch, basically. A whole morality from scratch. Poor dude. That's a lot of work.
Oh, man.
Well, it's preferred moral behavior is how he puts it. Because what he ended up doing was, at first he was kind of bitter with the church, then he actually went about the business of trying to actually build it from scratch. And he found out like how difficult it was. And because what he said was atheism was supposed to, what atheism did was like the church was like a cathedral and atheism ripped the roof off. But then there was, but it's like raining cold, and people had built this church to shelter them. But once you rip the roof off, then it's like, wait, what do we do now? Because it's cold, it's soggy, and you need something to replace it if you're going to do that. And I just thought it's just, to me, that's very interesting because it's like, wait a minute, we should have we didn't think about this.
Yeah, I appreciate him thinking through that with hesitancy. Like, I wonder how you do that without a pure like utilitarian, and that gets back to this cultural thing, this dilemma of people trying to define things, by like some sort of objective biological standard, and they end up just picking cultural standards instead.
Because cultural standards make sense.
Yeah.
And I wonder, well, actually, I have a question for you, MattC.
Yeah.
Do you think that there are some parts of culture that are biologically input, like somehow, like the epigenetic memory of a people can remember different things compared to one culture versus the other? That's I'm going into a really weird spot now. Oh my gosh.
I'm open to that, but like I feel like I'm
not race realism, guys. I swear.
See, I get like I always get proven wrong in the other direction with that stuff. The moment you try to settle into, okay, I found the foundations of what humanity looks like when they collectivize into some sort of community. And I can pattern that across every culture and every time period. There's always going to be some exception to that, and that exception disproves the rule because it means you didn't get that far down, because your thesis was that you got to the bottom. And if you can find an exception to the rule, then you haven't gotten to the bottom yet. And I just don't know. It's such a murky morass, I don't know.
Well,
that's why I'm even hesitant about the family structure, as sad as that sounds.
No, that is reasonable, because there are unhealthy families and there are different things. I feel like every single, in a weird, as much as I don't like the state, it's kind of a necessary evil, unfortunately, because it works half the time. I hate it, but at the same time, it's like, but it works, and there are reasons why it works. We can't do it.
Well,
even though God keeps warning people from like all the way in Samuel, like they had prophets and they had like this whole religious thing, and it was only God and they were like, we want to be like other people and have kings. And he's like, fine. Here's what'll happen. He's gonna take all your stuff, your women, you're just warning them and warning them, like, this is what's going to happen. But do it. No. Of course they don't.
Well, and I think one of the things you look at as far as that goes, that they hate the state versus whatever. I think one of the things that this is the other reason. Like, I personally believe that the ideal government, right? And I don't mean the one we should shoot for. I mean, I think that what would be the ideal form of government would be an anarchy. Because I don't think anybody is worthy of that kind of power, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of an organized government. I just don't think that fits into the human paradigm.
Oh, you know what? That just reminds me. There is one old democracy that managed to survive like millions, or not millions, but like compared to other people. It's San Marino. It's this tiny little country in the middle of Italy, and they've managed to maintain their own culture and their own republic for a long, long time. And how they did that was they just basically kind of kept to themselves, and they lived up on a mountain. And maybe that's part of the anarchy thing. But I just thought, if you want to...
Sorry, go ahead.
It's kind of based on Roman...
Oh, sorry. I keep thinking you're done.
No. What I meant to say, it's based on Roman ones. They have a consul, but it's like somehow it's all balanced out. So the person who votes has more because it's so small. It has more of that thing. But I think again, it goes back to good things come in small packages. I think.
Right.
Go back.
Well, like there's been one historical example of a long-running, successful anarchist government in human history that I'm aware of, and that was the island of Tristan da Cunha, which is English protectorate now, but it was founded by Portuguese and everything else, but it had run as only on anarchistic or ad hoc governance for several hundred years. But in the middle of the last century, the island was threatened. It's built on a volcanic island, and it was threatened by the volcano was erupting, and so although it was part of it was a crown protectorate, the crown had never actually done anything for them until the volcano, and they came in and brought everybody up to England because their homes were about to be wiped out. And they weren't entirely wiped out, but when people got back, they weren't so sure they wanted to rule themselves independently of Britain. And they've
of course
there's been and it's not completely gone, but they've had a more formal governance since then, where they've
damn it, it's always one a-hole that always screws it up for everybody.
Well, actually, one of the really interesting things is they had I can't remember if it was a member of the royal family or something. I think it was during Queen Victoria's reign. Somebody went down there, and one of the locals was given tours and everything, and got a lot of flack from his fellow citizens for acting like he ran the place. They felt, and so everyone called him Height because he was so important now, and they just made fun of him for it.
So they trolled him, basically.
Yeah. So, but anyway, so back to the premise. Like I said, I believe that that different religious structures have been created to try to make sense of the immaterial aspects of our existence, regardless of what we think the shape of those may be, and they still, though, I would contend, are part and parcel to the same structures, the same concepts of individualism versus group identity as the other areas of philosophy. And largely, it's because the question is are we, as beings, are we to be governed by other people's opinions of our existence or by our own opinions of our existence? Is our relationship to the transcendent our own, or is it defined by other human beings? Right. So even if you look at like conflicts within different denominations, they still come down to those same kind of ideas of, are we ruled by other people's ideas and traditions, or are they things we suss out for ourselves?
It's hard. It's hard to get that to do that balance between the two. And it is a balance. I mean, it's not like it's one over the other, I suppose. I feel like there's some things that do that. Although I will say this, nobody's ever tried a tiny or some like a small government. Everybody always wants more power or they want the state to do that. It's that desire to be ruled over. That's the thing I think nobody really talks about is that desire to be ruled. I think even Loki kind of talked about it in the MCU movies. But there is truth to that though. And I don't think people really explore that a lot.
And I think that is actually a religious question. And I think that comes down to, like I talk about, like the ideal of these things being an individualist perspective, right? That's what I think the ideal is. But it still comes down to, I think that our natural state. I think I said this. I think you were on the stream. I was talking about this last time, Matt. I think that our proper station is independence and self-rule, right? Within the context of a physical universe that does constrain us. Our proper station is this individualism, but our natural state is in slavery. That we I don't think we crave slavery. I think we just end up with it because if you're not going to be ruled, because everyone's ruled by something, our passions, our vices, whatever. That is, I think, is almost unavoidable.
Yeah.
I think that's why we look for kings and all that other kind of stuff. It's because,
or even look for heroes in a weird way too.
Yeah. Well, are the heroes to save us, or are the heroes to teach us to save ourselves? And that's a huge question. Within
That's that's good.
That's two definitions of politics right there. Those that want who are looking for someone to save them, and those that are looking
for inspiration.
Yeah. So that
well, that's kind of why Superman is so inspirational, is because he's so powerful, but he wields his power very lightly and has a lot of constraints on himself. So he's definitely more the aspirational. To borrow Professor Geek, the aspirational hero. That's why he's so like powerful and why we love him so much. Is because he wields it. Or someone else said it's a God who wants to be a human. That he identifies with that human so much.
Well, I mean, and one of the things, like the name, I'm not going to say that Siegel and Schuster were going for something that's complex, right? But the name Superman, Ubermensch, right? The concept is somebody that was elevated enough to define their own moral standards by themselves, excluding external things, right?
Baby philosophy 101, okay, Nietzsche.
Yeah. And so one of the things that Superman exhibits, though, is that he does not define his own morality. Right? He's defined by the conventions of rural America in the early 20th century. Community involvement, the duty of the individual to serve his fellow men within his capacity, the ability of the exceptional to look out for those who are not. Those are fundamental concepts that are required for societies to function, right? And the thing that I love about Superman is that, that the individual cannot succeed. It cannot succeed in helping others if he's not able to preserve himself, right? But because Superman is Superman, protecting himself is not an issue. He doesn't have to do that. And so he can attempt to save everyone because he himself is not in peril, right? And that sets him up very different from the sacrificial Knight of the Realm kind of character that Batman is.
The cathartic hero. That one's like the one that brings catharsis.
And with Batman, it has to be an act of sacrifice to save others because he does suffer. Whereas with Superman, he doesn't suffer. And so he can, there's no peril to himself. There's only the boldness and the trueness of his vision. And he becomes, and to tell him right, he needs to be pure in that. And that's, I think, what the Snyder movies miss entirely is that he has no reason to serve himself because he has all of his needs met, because he's complete within himself. But just another schmuck who doesn't understand the nature of power, it weakens the story as a whole.
Well, it's more of the power myth. I really don't feel like a lot of storytellers really are digging into either if you can't do the mythology, honestly examine yourself. Or and then there's some people like King, what's his face? The one that's did the Batman and Catwoman married thing and flew up in his face. He's a man just wallowing in trauma. He can't go beyond his trauma.
Yeah, and that's at the risk of playing armchair psychologist, Matt, there is another example of the failing of the family unit. Just in case you were curious about that, Tom King grew up no dad, and then he went.
And his mom probably was a hoe.
Well,
I'm sorry. I'm just watching. What was it? Someone was looking at all the mommy issues that keep popping up in there too. That's oh man. Well, like she's like apparently people show up drunk or they're drinking all the time or something. Like, oh geez.
Well, and even like the storyline, the one of the few complete Tom King storylines I read through because I find him so insufferable. Was the I Am Bane storyline, and in it, Bruce finds the strength to defeat Bane because of the power of his mommy issues and because I am Batman, and really, really off-putting, especially because if you've been reading Batman for any length of time, the strength he always derives from the legacy of his father has been a huge goal. I mean, a huge aspect.
I think that's what people can smell. They can smell daddy and mommy issues a mile away.
Well, and I mean, like I think there's some real place in the Batman story for daddy issues, because one of the things that you have in a story like that is, okay, so Batman's the protector of the realm. Right?
Yeah, and he's also an orphan, so there are legitimate, like, not slight maladjustments. You could probably go with that. Although,
so he's responsible to take care of the kingdom, but he never knew how because he didn't have his father. So he has to invent it all himself, and he invents it with a bat costume, right? So it's pretty straightforward storytelling to get from A to B on something like that. But it's also something that Tom King just totally disregarded in the way he wanted to tell the story, because
he said he just wants to do something else. And I loved what was his name, the curmudgeon-y old guy, Frank Miller, said to him. He's like, well, it's Batman, you can just do whatever you want. And Frank Miller, he's old and craggly looking, and he's like a crotchety old man. He just turns to him and says, but it wouldn't be a Batman story. Yeah. Just so soft and so, like, pointed, and I'm like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's pretty
I
awesome.
love how crotchety he is. I don't know. Like some people, I think it can be put off because artists, I think a lot of people can like either piss off artists or do other things because artists are pretty prickly. I've got to say something here because I think a lot of people like get on people's bad side and don't realize artists are really prickly and sometimes you just piss them off and that's why they block
Yeah.
you just because you rub them the wrong way. And I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it is something to consider when you're interacting with artists. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just
Just
it's a
saying it
thought.
simply is. It's a part of existence.
Mm-hmm. Dang straight. Although one of our guys came back, he said, I can't put neurons in a cup. There's actual neuroscience behind the emotions. Chemical reactions precedes mechanical response.
You can put neurons in a cup, but it won't make a brain.
Right. It's hard. Like it's hard to figure out where the chicken and the egg is.
And I mean, and they are able to stimulate by using electricity and chemicals. They can stimulate reactions in the brain. But
Gosh.
once again, I mean, when we as we're experiencing those things, as far as we can monitor, they're happening simultaneously. So just because you can artificially create them doesn't mean that that's what's happening when we're experiencing them in the real world.
I don't know. It's a bad idea to give AI too much power. Like a lot of people are like, "Oh, we should give AI in charge of the bombs and stuff." I'm like, no. People are flawed, but no. I don't. We've watched Terminator. We watched all this other crap. We
Well,
know
here's the problem with that is who builds the AI, right?
liberals.
Just people.
I'm sorry. That's been my experience. Okay. I don't trust them.
I'm just
Let's
saying
make
people
all,
in general,
not all liberals, but or even like overly conservative. Maybe you just no. It's a bad idea.
Okay.
Don't
So,
let AI do it.
and is we as humans, if we are broken and flawed, right? If we are incomplete, if we believe there is an ideal that we do not and cannot live up to, then why would something that we create be assumed to be better than us, right? The watchmaker is always greater than the watch, right? Because the watch sprang from his imagination. So
Watchmen.
yeah. So anything that we can create is lesser than us, by just the way it is. And so that's something to think on with that, which is why AI is a rightfully, I think, to be considered carefully. Also, the fact that our understanding of understanding is so limited, that just look at how predictive text works, and you can get a good guess.
Correct.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
You guys, I discovered a website. I can't remember who it was with. Somebody on Twitter mentioned it, but there's a website called Talking to Transformers, and it's a predictive text AI that tries to paragraphs based upon a few words you type in, and it's hilarious.
Or have you ever seen Internet Historian on YouTube out of curiosity?
I don't think so.
Oh my gosh, you should check it out. It's really funny. He does like kind of obscure things that have happened. But there was on Twitter, Microsoft made this learning AI called Tay. And so it's a chat box and it's supposed to be like the 16-year-old girl that you interact with. And they just unleashed her on the internet and didn't think about what would happen with her. So she went to spouting off Hitler did nothing wrong. She liked Trump. She did all those other but once she did Hitler did nothing wrong, they were like, shut it down, turn it off. And everyone's like, bring Tay back. Don't do it.
Yeah, because she was taught how to think just from interacting with
the
how people decide.
with
Yeah.
the cesspool of Twitter, and it's like, what
Yeah.
did you expect?
Yeah.
I feel like these people they want to do it, but they don't really think very hard about the Well, again, it's engineers. Engineers just are like, oh, okay, you have a problem? Okay, I'll fix the problem. They won't necessarily think about, maybe that's not the right way to go about it. Like, it works, though. It's like, good, you really shouldn't.
Yeah. Actually, I'm actually really excited. Not somewhat tangent, but next week I'm having Dan Sakharov from the Mythoverse on, and we're going to be talking.
Oh, yeah, he's really cool. I like him.
It's also really interesting because he is, of course, an engineer. So, and one who has taken time to think about some of the big questions that engineering can imply. So I'm really looking forward to talking to him about Adobe Kroger. I just recently finished the audio book, and so that's on the discussion for next week. Somewhat unrelated, but I'm excited for it.
Oh yeah, that'll be good too. I can't make it next week because I've got live drawing class that week, but I'll definitely listen to it later.
Sweet.
Yo, that'll be so cool.
I'm excited to see more player drawings. They're always make me happy.
Oh, good. I'm glad because they're kind of. I think the problem is I compare myself to everybody else on Twitter that does stuff like probably more active than I am, and I'm just like, okay, I'm just really frustrated. I think is more like I want to get done. I want to get something productive done, but it's also like half the time I'm pregnant and I want to sleep. It's this dang pregnancy thing. This is why women's lives are complicated. Dang it!
It's true. You are not correct at all.
It's something we can attempt to sympathize with, but
it's okay if you don't.
Really
it's okay if you don't. I there are things you have to. Well, here's the thing. Men are still considered, even if they're more likely to be dumped by society. Women, no matter how useless, are never dumped by society because vagina. I don't know why. No matter what, I mean, it's like
I actually do know why.
Well, potentiality of the womb. That's why.
Yeah, that's a big part of it, and there's the procreative aspect of it, but there's also the fact that for like it or not, and I really do believe this is the case, because we are wired as men to protect the weaker, and I think that's part of our societal structure. That tends to be womankind, not exclusively, mind you, but it's on the list, you know.
Well, that's why I conceal carry.
There you go.
So, I know my odds. The odds are not very good.
No, we got to balance that. That's what that's what your firearm's for.
Exactly.
I got to tell you, this is the second conversation on the internet I have been involved with today on a live stream that had to do with guns. I tuned in to Dave Comics this morning, and I saw they were talking about I can't remember whose project it was right now, but it was T-Bird and Throttle, and I was like, oh, this sounds interesting. And I tuned in, and they're immediately talking about what's the best sidearm to carry in Florida. And I was just like, man.
Oh man.
I gotta tune into that.
I freaking love this community.
Well, I think it's just like I think maybe indie comics is drawing more of the people who have, and this is whether you're a comic skate or not, it is drawing people who are very kind of independent minded, but also that just independent period, like thinking about where to go. I was like listening. Have you ever heard of Ellis? He was on what's his face? Doug Tenaple's show on occasion, but he's this older gentleman, and he has one, and it's just him and his friend, and they're on for like a half hour or something, and it was hilarious because it was him talking about I guess he lives in California, but his house got robbed, and like he had one ancient shotgun that got stolen. but he was like looking at what the legality was for a gun, and of course
Oh
my
yeah,
it's
I love
just
that guy, Willis or
Ellis,
Ellis.
Wise Ellis. He's Wise Ellis on Twitter.
Yeah, he's great.
He also did like I think it's a Free Cat and Other Tales. He does kind of this pulpy, kind of creepy stuff. It's really cool. I like his stuff. And the other guy's
He
Todd.
liked the link to this live stream. I was hoping he'd tune in.
Oh yeah, that would be really cool.
Yeah.
But no, what I like about anyway, but he was talking about how his stuff he's like, okay, I basically found this like sawed off, it's apparently legal or not shotgun, and I'm like, who cares if it's legal? Just get it. Because well, he's had his house broken into. It's like, don't even know. And if you need to just bury the body, who cares? It's in California. They're not gonna go looking for it. I'm sorry if the cops can't do anything. I'm not saying anything bad about cops, but if they're not doing anything, you got to take care of yourself.
Yeah, that's scary. There was something about him. It was like within minutes, like he went out for a walk or something, a short walk, and came home, and
he said he got cased. He wasn't sure if it was like his girlfriend's ex-boyfriend or something, or no, that was a different. So he's gotten robbed multiple times. This poor dude. He's got, like his one of his other girlfriends, like they were traveling and someone like just went through the stuff and then poured out all her stuff and then hid all this, like robbed it. He robbed them in this hotel. He stole all their stuff and then he put everything that he wanted in the suitcase and then went out with the suitcase. So he looked like he was a traveler. Yeah. It was just like really smooth, and they were just like, "What?" But yeah, I've had my gun stolen too from my car.
Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah, that was in North Seattle, because there wasn't legality. So I kind of, after that, I kind of was like, I'm like, if they don't have metal detectors, they're not gonna know.
Yeah.
It sounds bad. It depends, like when you're going to a city hall and they do have gun detectors. Okay, I don't feel bad going into a location like that because they have armed security and that makes sense. If you have a gun-free zone, you better have like a metal detector and a whole check-in security. You can't have it just this willy-nilly whatever because everybody will come in with one.
Yeah.
So. That's why I just conceal carry. I have it. I have the permit. I can do it, and I just pray I don't get in a situation. But yeah, it is insane to me. It is a form of insanity, really. If you want to get it down to it, it's like, do you purposely want people to die? Like, do you care that little for your common person, common man?
Yeah.
So it's about 10 here.
Yep.
It's midnight here.
Yeah, I gotta probably get there because I didn't have dinner yet. Probably a little too late for dinner, but oh well.
So
I'll see.
This has been a really fun conversation.
I'm glad because I feel like I interrupted most of the time.
Well, that's okay. That's part of how conversation works on there. I will be honest, there was one particular point that I was leaning toward that I did not get on to talk about, which is why I think that the political spectrum as we know it is actually broken, and because it doesn't and never was functional.
Well, because it's people who want power over those who don't.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I will
Yeah.
close with this thing, and we can have maybe a real quick if you want to do another 5 minutes. The concept of the left-right paradigm, right, was first invented in your favorite country, Claire, France.
Of course, it would be France.
And what it was in post-terror France, in their Senate, there were the conservatives. They were closet royalists who sat on the right side of the aisle, and then the French Republicans sat on the left side of the aisle. Okay, and so the Republicans, the French Republicans, believed in central control, managed there in France, in Paris. They believed in egalitarianism, and they did not believe in private property. They thought the government should handle all the property, and that is how you protect the common man from the wealthy, was by stealing all the wealthy people's stuff. They were
Always stealing other people's stuff. It never worked.
They were proto-socialists, and actually it was that society that Bastiat was part of, where he came up with the concept of legal plunder. Not directly from that, but in that society was where he grew up from, right? And so that was the opinion of the left, right? Was that central control, disallowing of private property, and then government enforced atheism was the other one that many of them held. Okay. On the right hand of the aisle, they didn't think that killing all the royals was a good idea.
No.
They thought that the counties, especially the rural ones, could probably manage themselves. And they didn't think that taking all of the rich people's stuff was fair, right? So they were more inclined with private property rights, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So when you break down, and then it wasn't until the progressive era, in the Gilded Age here in America, that people brought that left-right paradigm over into America, right? But if you look just the way in the French system, right, just that system, then American constitutionalism, by comparison, is so far to the right that it may as well be anarchy, okay? Because you're talking about decentralized control, you're talking about private property rights, you're talking about conservative, not letting the government have control over religion, right? All that kind of stuff being so far removed to the right, it may as well have been anarchy, right? So,
well, it probably was considered anarchy back in the day.
Well, I mean, there actually were a lot of anarchists who didn't believe in the legitimacy of government, and there was a proto-libertarian by the name of Lysander Spooner that had some very interesting things to say on the subject. I disagree with Spooner on one take, because I think that governments are inevitable. I don't think that government's a necessary evil. I think government's simply inevitable, because government, anytime two people agree on how a thing ought to be, that's a governmental power has been enforced, that had been created at that point. So even in informal governments like Tristan da Cunha, the individual choices from neighbor to neighbor are still governmental in nature. Right?
I suppose.
Because it creates contracts, and contracts are obligations, and obligations are law in one frame or another, because they're expected to be maintained further on. And so that's how that ends up working out. So
wait, so what's the 2-minute version of this? Just so I can, unless you can let me leave early, because it's 11:58 and I got work.
So
I'm loving this, but
okay. So here we go. Here, real quick.
Yeah.
So if the left-right paradigm are as originally envisioned are fixed concepts, right? Because those two are mutually exclusive ideas, right? You either have rule by self or rule by the authorities, right? You can have some mingling in there, but when you take those to the extreme, right? Anarchy, true anarchy, the lack of government, right? Total self-rule cannot exist in cooperation with state-run everything, right? And so my proposal is that the only real paradigm is individualism versus collectivism or statism, right? And every governmental system fits on there somewhere. And so when we've been taught about, that there's conservative and liberal, and those are relative terms, but this individualism versus collectivism is really not relative, because there's a fixedness to it.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason we have so much debate is that people specifically misunderstand that we're talking about individual duty versus individual duty and freedom, because those things are connected to each other. and somebody else running us for us.
Is that it?
Yep, that's it.
Okay. In other words, no one's ever really tried anarchism. No one's ever tried it. Everybody always, yeah. Or
Well,
smaller governments.
People like say anarchy when they mean like governmental chaos. But that's
No, it's just assholes that just want to throw rocks.
right. And see,
It happens all season around spring. It's one thing, and they do that, and I get pissed, and I just want them to get the the crap kicked out of them because they're annoying and a pest.
but in a pure sense, those aren't anarchists because they are using force to push their will upon other people. So they are in fact acting.
And there's our other problem is the force problem.
So it's because another definition for government that I really like is that it's that good government is the codified violence of righteous men.
In theory, yeah.
That's good government.
Yeah, well, I think we need a little more righteous fury, in my opinion, especially to all the pedos that got away with Epstein's suicide.
Yeah.
Frankly, you know what? Here's the thing. Since we have a little black book, why don't we just prosecute every last one of those frickers? Or since they already killed him, maybe they should all die. They should all die since they're in the black book anyway.
Well, that's a whole thing.
Oh, sorry, I'm a little much.
You're presuming he's dead. I think I saw him on the island a few days ago.
I don't think so. I've thought about that. Maybe he's like in. I've actually thought about that he's in that, but the fact that he died by like the bone, it's just weird. No one bought the suicide thing. It doesn't matter what aisle.
Yeah.
That's what's so hilarious.
We can all agree on that.
We're like, no, it wasn't suicide. Whether he snuck away or what have you. And I know that sounds like really rough, but the reason why I think the feelings of all those people should be punished in the black book that he had is that the fact he was gone, he is not being punished. It's an insult to the rest of us who aren't wealthy. Like, I don't care about people's stuff as much as I care about them living under our laws. And that's weird that the socialist is looking at the money and the wealth, whereas I feel like maybe more independent or whatever people, I care about if you play by the right rules. And it's different if you get a lawyer, at least you're participating in that. If you get a crack lawyer and you're able to get off on whatever, hey, you got the best lawyer. That's at least you've played by the rule. But if someone like just all this backhanded kind of crap, nah, I can't abide by that. And it's like, you should seriously be punished.
No.
Sorry,
Fair.
it's really scary. I sound really scary.
No. Hashtag fair.
Fair. No, one law, not one law for the end, not for the kind of crap either. Because then it does get violent. And I say that because it's like, that's the truth. Like, if there is that disconnect, then people die. Because it's like you either codify to it or not. So you can stand going to jail with or being whatever, have a little ankle bracelet. Like Hillary didn't even get a freaking ankle bracelet or something, at least. It's like if she even had that, I think people wouldn't be as pissed.
Mm-hmm.
Then she could just stay home and drink white wine and and not bother anyone. Sorry. Yeah. Anyway, I guess everybody's trying to go, so why don't you wrap it up?
I wish I could continue, but I gotta
go.
go.
That's fine, guys. Thank you so much for coming on tonight. I know went a little far afield on stuff.
No, I think we covered all of them, all of the subjects.
Touched every pillow.
Yeah,
that's good.
Well, that's what I was going for. But
okay, good.
Yeah, we also got
I don't know how subtle or how blunt I was, but well.
Well, and I do the one thing that I was excited for that I didn't get to is more of the practical that I really want to get more into because I think that those things still tie into each other very well.
Yeah. We'll
Like,
get there another time.
yeah, but that's okay.
Yeah.
So, guys,
Good conversations were had. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Matt.
Good conversations were had, and that's the important thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, for you guys that were joining the chat, thank you very much. I do appreciate you guys tuning in. And this has been the Mattriarchy, our 2.5 hour version. And we will be back next week. We've got.
Why are they not 2.5 hours?
It has. Well, next week will probably only be 2, hopefully. But in hour 1, we've got Dan Sakharov coming on to talk about Adobe Kroger. And then in hour 2, my webcomic buddy Matt Johnson from East Nebraska is going to be joining us. And I think we're probably going to talk about Matt's hobby of meeting every politician he can and getting pictures with them. He goes to a ridiculous number of rallies and he's met all kinds of people and it's fascinating. So
cool.
We'll talk about that some next week. So, and then the week after, I think we're going to try to get some metal guy on here to talk about the Thrasher campaign, but you got to set that up for sure. So anyway, guys, thanks for tuning in and we will see you all next time around. Thanks.